Welcome to Risk Revolution, a podcast series that examines all aspects of risk management in the life sciences industry. We'll talk to industry experts on best practices for identifying risk, assessing risk, measuring solutions, implementing solutions, and monitoring results. Here are your hosts, Nuala and Val, Valerie Mulholland, and Laurie Richter.
Welcome back to Risk Revolution, the show that keeps risk management fresh, feisty, and dare I say, for us at least, fun. This month, it's just Val and myself. Laurie is, as always, busy. And it's July, which means we're actually halfway through 2025. Val, can you believe it? We've racked up 5 core episodes, 4 guest interviews, 7+ hours on air, and hundreds of LinkedIn comments. Not that we're counting.
Well, we are counting, Nuala. Data-driven culture, remember? And you know what? Every single like is another neuron in our collective knowledge brain. So I'm looking forward to collecting some of the neurons we sparked this year so far because, I don't know, 2025, every episode was a gem, I think. And it just seems right to take some time to reflect and link the key messages from them.
Yeah, great. And of course, the first episode of 2025 was our birthday episode. And Val, you got to celebrate the 20th anniversary of ICHQ9 with Professor Kevin O'Donnell, one of our great friends.
I did. Now, in case our listeners don't know, Professor O'Donnell was the rapporteur for the update to ICHQ9. So yeah, I re-listened to that episode. And of course, in it, he spoke about each of what I call the 4 horsemen of the ICHQ 901 revision. That is formality, subjectivity, risk-based decision-making, and drug shortage risk. So it's a really good episode to listen back on, folks, if you haven't listened to it already. But I think the key message for me in that episode was his plea to stop regarding ICHQ 901, indeed QRM in general, like gospel, and to start treating it like a science. You know, in the episode, he reflected on the nitrosamine crisis and the fact that among the very serious concerns that exposed were some of the issues that we talk about on this podcast: light touch hazard ID, over-reliance on FMEA, perhaps a stagnation in risk skills. You know, I felt he was just holding up Exhibit A for pure QRM. No, he's written about all that before, you know, that ICH made great, ICHQ9 when it came out in 2005, it made great inroads into risk management. You know, we started doing things we never did before, like root cause analysis and such. But after a decade, it did seem to plateau, and despite every enabler available, improved computerization and digitization, it just all seemed to stagnate. And I know you often talk about that, Nuala, the fact that we seem to travel lightly beyond the second box on that ICHQ9 flow diagram, that analysis box, you know. Anyway, I would listen back to the episode there in recent weeks, and kind of around the same time, somebody was speaking to me about a challenge in their organisation of keeping risk assessments up to date as live documents. And I think hidden in that question was part of the ongoing challenge, because QRM is not just about documents, is it? Perhaps it's about the culture we need to keep QRM live, that ongoing awareness of hazards, hazardous situations, knowing and understanding our preferred risk responses, understanding our risk controls, our risk communication, and constantly growing that learning as per our other colleague, Marty Lippa's RKI cycle, risk knowledge infinity cycle. So maybe we need to encourage that change of mindset from compliance to science. So yeah, in that episode, I think Kevin reminded us that ICHQ901 is a high-level, non-prescriptive guidance, and treating it like a gospel, which is what we did the first time, it froze learning for a decade. And maybe as a lesson learned from that, we can't let this revision suffer the same fate. What do you think?
Yeah, I think he introduced something that became part of our season's refrain, and certainly the red thread that connects many of our episodes this season, you know, where he says tools are tools, but mindsets move mountains. And I know from my own practice that most of my time working with teams now is about getting that patient-focused excellence mindset established and embedded, not only within the QRM leads, and QRM responsibles or the process owners, but much more importantly in the frontline teams, whether that's frontline on the on the manufacturing floor, it could be in the logistics or supply chain management, or it could be in QC at the lab bench. But all too often, I still come across risk assessments that have no process users or front end teams involved. And for me, this is like, a major weakness, if not a hanging offense. And it potentially undermines the whole purpose of the exercise. If we're going to sit in a room and conduct a risk assessment with a series of SOPs and batch manufacturing records and other specifications and documents available to us, but without the people who actually know how to run the process, even if it's a new product introduction, even if we're prospectively looking at it from a validation point of view. In most cases, we have users who are familiar with our processes, even if they're not familiar with this product. As we all know, what's written down in the SOPs and what presents itself in the MBRs and master batch records is often not exactly how things actually get done. And without those frontline users, we're missing two pieces. One, we're missing all that tacit knowledge that can turbocharge our insights around the knowledge, process understanding, and the knowledge that we need to help us understand those risks. But more importantly, as you say, we travel lightly beyond the risk assessment box. Risk communication, which is one of the key aspects of a risk management program. A lot of the teams that I work with think about risk communication in terms of communicating upwards in the organization through the risk register or, some other mechanism by which they're notifying the senior leaders around the risks that are still they're exposed to. But for me, risk communication is much more important down to the front line so that they actually know what to look out for, which are the hazards and the hazardous situations that we're concerned about, which ones affect our, critical quality attributes or our critical material aspects and things like that. And to have them then acting, and I know I've used this term many times before, crowdsourcing your risk reduction, because without that connection, the way we write our risk assessments and the way we implement those sets of risk controls, we don't call them out. This is a risk control for this purpose in the documentation and the training that we provide for them. So having them involved so that they become aware and familiar, and now they're acting as your advocates, they're acting as your eyes and ears. Like I say, it is a completely irrelevant process going through a risk assessment without some of the process users who really know the day-to-day utilization. But look, I regularly ask the team about what they think the purpose of an effective risk management program is. And I get various responses, around, it's a systematic approach, et cetera, to, identifying and assessing risks and what have you. But the response often misses the point. And Q9 indeed told us earlier, but Q9R1 also repeats it. And it tells us in the introduction on the first page, an effective quality risk management approach can further ensure the quality of drug product, of course, to the patient by providing a proactive means of identifying and controlling potential quality issues. So the whole purpose of an effective risk management system is not to conduct risk assessments in some back room and then, as you say, keep those documents live. The whole purpose is to identify and control potential quality issues or those hazards and hazardous situations that can arise. And so it is about controlling the risks. And sometimes people can get so hung up on the FMEA or whatever tool they're using, they forget that the real purpose is actually A, to identify where the hazards are, and B, to put an appropriate control in place to reduce the likelihood of occurrence or reduce or eliminate that hazard in the first case. So Of course, and now with Q9R, one emphasizing around, like you said, supply chain risk and patient drug shortages, avoiding those supply disruptions are seen as equally important to patient safety as product quality previously had been emphasized in the earlier Q9. So I actually think I really like this new hazard approach. It might seem like a nuance that they've gone from risk identification to hazard identification, but for me, it pairs it right back. And it gets us away from that emphasis, that unhealthy obsession we had with identifying risks, which then led us straight into jumping into the numerical risk priority numbers, and then which I call fake math, which it is. I mean, it's completely made up, and all we have a tendency to do then is to, force it into the green zone under the threshold so that we can proceed forward. So looking for me now in this hazard identification, which obviously is one of the four horsemen that you mentioned about, moves us closer.
Fifth horseman, actually.
Yeah, indeed, yeah. But moves us closer to this, really thinking about what problem or hazard are we trying to solve for, and how will we control that hazard, and how should we document our rationale around why we selected that control for that hazard. And finally, then, what measures or monitoring regime should we put into place to prove that control effectively manages or eliminates or reduces the likelihood of occurrence of that hazard? So for me, they're really my four horsemen now is, identify the problem or the hazard, come up with a control that you deem appropriate, and move up the risk hierarchy so that you're not just doing the ones which are, retrain and rewrite the SOPs. And confirm that our control is effective by having some metrics in place whereby you're going to go back on a routine basis, maybe as part of your CPV program or your oversight program or your batch review process, and ensure that control is effective. And for me, then it doesn't really matter what tool you're using. If you're focusing on the identification of the hazard and the control that matches that hazard. So, okay, I'll get off my soapbox now. But next up, our early March episode saw Laurie sit down with Anders Vinther for a lesson in disruptive thinking, where Anders argued that we need to turn quality from a cost center to a business driver. What do you think about that?
That was actually our most listened to episode this year.
Oh, very good. Excellent. Well, there you go on the stats, Val. So obviously Anders is a founder and CEO of QBA, Quality Business Administration, which trains quality leaders to transition from that, traditional quality management to a much more business quality leadership concept. And in 2024, QBA launched its Quality Business Leadership Programme in partnership with our own alma mater, TU Dublin's Graduate Business School. So there was a great opportunity for Laurie to sit down with Anders, and of course they had worked previously together in a former life. But I liked listening back there. I liked where Anders outlined the 6 traits that he's defined for this business leadership of quality, which he knitted into his playbook. And he describes the 6 traits as visible responsibility, quality owned by all, engage your employees, ensure your decisions are risk informed, and make sure you can adequately identify the financial value of quality, as well as that one global quality framework that he's a great advocate for. So I think it was a lovely callback to Kevin O'Donnell's tools versus mindset line. When Anders spoke about shifting away from that cost of quality mindset, where we think about compliance being a burden on the business, to a quality value index, he called it the QVI. And the need for us to get away from that cost language and get much more closer to maximizing the value of quality and risk-informed decision making. So I think part of Anders' call to action was that change starts with us. Learn the basic finances, build your own QVI, and partner with operations instead of acting as the sheriff in town or attempting to police them. What were your reflections about Laurie and Anders' episode, Val?
Very similar, I suppose, if Kevin reminded us why rigorous science matters, Anders showed us how turning that science into everyday practice can transform quality from a cost gate to a growth engine. I mean, the reality is that quality, risk, business value, they all live on the same balance sheet at the end of the day. But, the standout for me, and I've used that quote very often since the episode, was Anders' opening salvo. We set the bar at the floor, let's raise it to the ceiling. Yeah. And that shift, as you described, from cost of quality to the quality value index. I mean, language matters when you're trying to sell quality to the C-suite. If you really want executives leaning in, translate defects into euros. Anders called it, if I recall, the financial risk number. You were talking about the RPN number, the financial risk number. Show them that a $15,000 preventative fix today can avoid a $2 million recall next quarter. I mean, when you think about it, Nuala, harking back to Kevin and the point he was making about the nitrosamines, how much did that crisis cost the sector? Hundreds of millions of dollars, I suppose.
If not more, yeah.
If not more, exactly. And, when risk like that hits the P&L account, everybody, including the C-suite, suddenly has to find the money, the budget to fix it. But, is that the best spend? Is that the best time to spend? Is that the best value for spend? I think they're the points we're trying to make here. And do you know what? Another bingo card moment from that episode was his Deming remix, as I'm calling it. How did it go now? He said something like, focus on quality and costs drop, focus on cost and quality may suffer. Was that it?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I regularly translate that in my own terms as what's good for the patient is good for the business, but what's good for the business does not always turn out to be good for the patient. We can take decisions that we think are good for the business in terms of cost saving or outsourcing, and sometimes that increases the risk to the patient, and we don't necessarily quantify that. So I loved that element of, and it was so much common sense. That Anders, he's got huge experience and a huge leverage. He's really being a driver for change and a key influencer out there. Whether it's through industry contacts or through his deep regulatory network as well. So it was great to have Anders on, and I really do wish him well, because I hope that we do start to see a transformation in terms of how quality is viewed from a C-suite perspective. And indeed, that nice little segue from the Deming reference there, Val, leads us nicely into one of my favourite episodes of the year with my good friend Matt Pearson, who is the VP of Quality, the Quality System and Risk Management at Guardant Health. And, I think you discussed it at the time in the episode, about how Matt's experience, he comes to it from a black belt and an operational excellence perspective in his original career, and here he is now head of quality systems and risk management. But his background, I believe, and I've known him over the years, has positioned him perfectly to integrate his approach to building and sustaining a healthy quality culture, while driving forward always on continuous improvement and reducing the exposure for the business through proactive risk management. So this concept within a quality culture that focuses on that patient first, patient focused excellence, and how risk management and continuous improvement are two sides of the one coin. I can't emphasize how important that view is, because again, we still see, some silo mentalities within the sector, where too often we see different functions having responsibility for risk management or quality risk management, and some other function having continuous improvement or operational or business excellence under its remit. And in fact, sometimes I arrive into these organizations and I find that the two are actually pulling against each other, when in fact they all have a similar goal, which is to get as much product to the patient as possible, at the right quality at the right time. I think Matt going back to unpack that mindset loop, which we included in the ISPE Cultural Excellence Report way back in 2017, that the two of us were co-leaders on at that time, around how mindsets impact the prevalent attitudes in the company. And those attitudes are directly linked to the behaviors that we observe in an organization, or maybe even the behaviors that we tolerate within the organization. And of course, when we talk about behavior, sometimes people are saying, oh God, that gets a bit woolly, Nuala. But, I've said before, behaviors are things we do and things we say. So they're actually very easy to observe and even count, which is why, key behavioral indicators are very useful in looking at this mindset shift. But those behaviors then are directly linked to the results that we get. And as I say, sometimes the results we deserve rather than the ones we desire. And that obviously impacts the organizational performance. So Matt, going back and bringing that out, that if you want the results, or indeed, if you don't like the results that you're getting, or you want to enhance your performance at the moment, you've got to start by changing the mindset that produced them. Otherwise, you're just trying to leverage the last cog in the whole mechanism, and you're just not going to have enough forward motion. Whereas if you go right back to the beginning and start looking at those mindsets, impacting the attitudes, identifying the behaviors that support successful outcomes and performance enhancement, and reward and recognize people who are engaging in the process in that way, then you will get the improvement, the performance improvement and continuous improvement that you like. What do you think about that, Val?
Yeah, there we are. You see, mindsets. It wasn't documents, it was mindsets. That was the red thread that linked Kevin and Anders and then Matt, And I remember Matt, he said, you start with mindset. It's not a logo on a wall. Mindsets, it determines the results you get, But for me, Nuala, when you listen back to those episodes, I got more out of them the second time than I nearly did the first time. Did that make sense? They're very, listenable again and again and again. And so when I was listening back to it, I loved the quote, be fire prevention officers, not firefighters, And he gave us, I think, 3 enablers of that. You probably tuned more into this than me because this is your space. But if I remember, there was visual management, standard accountability, leader standard work. And I remember him saying, stop rewarding heroics, celebrate the teams who stopped the fire from starting in the first place.
Yeah, absolutely. And those, again, very much integrated. You can see the way that Matt's thinking and his approach and successful approaches within his organizations to that implementation is around integrating those enablers, where he talks about the importance of visual management. Many of us would be familiar with seeing tier boards in organizations or, shift huddle boards. But the importance of that is making sure that, everyone is clear on the task and the priorities, and there's clear visual metrics that everybody is exposed to every day. It becomes part of the routine, 10, 15, 20 minutes. We come together, we identify what's in front of us, certainly in those frontline tiers, you're looking at a horizon of yesterday, today, and tomorrow. And then when you move up to the tier 2, which might be your shift leads or your area managers, you want them focusing on a horizon of last week, this week, next week. What are we setting ourselves up for success in next week? Is someone out there on scout duty for that? And then as we move up to tier 3 with the visual management for the leaders, we've got to make sure they're not still down in the weeds, solving today's problems in the fighting mode, and that they're looking at the quarter, last month, this month, and next month. And what are we doing about planning our schedules and our resources for next month, so we're setting our teams up for success, and we're not having this ever-changing production schedule, which is, again, when I go in and work with teams, invariably I find the tail wagging the dog in terms of the production schedule and changes happening, and people trying to be agile, but in fact in that agility when the organization isn't set up to do that, we just don't have that capacity to move at that pace, and that's where the problems then mistakes happen, and we end up more rush, less haste, or more haste, less rush, or whatever progress. But I love that he talks about those clear visual metrics, making sure that everyone can see if we're winning or losing on our daily and weekly targets. And that promotes accountability, that coming together and being clear about what the priorities are and what might have to slip today as a result of making, a team-based decision on a priority. It promotes accountability, as I like to describe it, as a team sport. I have for teams where accountability and ownership get kind of bandied around and nobody's accountable for anything. I like to talk about you're assigned responsibility for a task as a result of a project schedule or a minutes in a meeting. The individual has to take ownership for responsibility for those tasks. But accountability is your team coming towards you in an act of support to say, are you set up? Do you have everything you need? Do you need more help? I have some time this afternoon. I can assist you with that if things aren't getting done. And being prepared to, have that conversation, to nudge if we see some of our colleagues losing focus or being overwhelmed. And that's the accountability that really Matt was talking about, that us leaning in as a team to say, we've said this is a priority, so what do we need to do to get it across the line? So a support of accountability. And then the all-important piece about leader standard work, which ensures that we engage the leaders in the process on a routine basis, and that they're not just coming around for the odd walk, Gemba walk, and it gets them away from that kind of we're dialing it in style of leadership, so that they're integrated into seeing where the challenges are, and that they're part of the process of removing the barriers, and they see that every day. And that has to be that routine involvement and engagement, real engagement by the leadership in taking ownership for the work. I do some work, and I know Matt probably has done this one as well, around who's packing our parachute and getting those leaders to really understand, the value that's being created in the organization is being done at the front line, not in Teams meetings or in boardrooms, and that's we have to support that tip of the spear. So yeah, I really liked the fact that he talked about those three enablers. And of course, Matt also quoted Carol Dweck, who has that book, Mindsets, where people won't suggest a better way if they fear blame. So if they fear they're going to be held accountable in a bad way, in a negative way, that why would they put their head above the parapet and suggest a recommendation for an improvement? And that, of course, reminds me of Amy Edmonson, who is my task for the book club for next month, The Right Kind of Wrong. And she does a lot of work around psychological safety and making sure that people are comfortable with stepping forward if they see something that doesn't look right, which is so important. So we come back to our summer reads in the book club towards the end. But April's episode, what did we get to in April?
Yeah, well, we got another book club suggestion out of April, if I remember rightly, because this episode was with Barry Byrne, who leads the knowledge management strategy in Novartis and is the founder of the very successful Knowledge Summit. I can say that now, having attended the June one, because I was bowled over by it. It really was so energetic. Anyway, the podcast, we called it From Battlefields to Biopharma, because we went through Barry's really unique background again, from Irish peacekeeping through to, he talked about everything. He went from that to NASA, if I remember rightly. Yeah. The mic drop moment for me actually was when he said, because he was talking about knowledge management, if you hire 100 knowledge workers, hire one to help them share the knowledge, because for every 100 knowledge workers, budget one knowledge facilitator who curates the stories, publishes the micro case studies, keeps that library alive and flowing and creative. And I know AI is going to greatly enable knowledge management, but again, AI is a tool. A human needs to create that knowledge and that knowledge sharing mindset. Are we back to mindsets again? There we go. Couple of other really interesting points when I listened back in it. He also spoke about shrinking knowledge latency, that time between an event and the moment the lesson becomes reusable. I really liked that because, in a way, it did echo Matt's mindset loop, an after action feedback loop in real time. And he spoke about many other really practical ways of measuring knowledge flows. He mentioned the knowledge sharing ratio. I like that one too. He tracks hours spent disseminating against the hours spent creating. So, I mean, if you spend, X many hours creating knowledge, and if that's sizable, he aims for a target of 15% time spent then sharing it to avoid other people having to repeat that effort. I thought that's a really clever metric. And, going back to Andrews, then again, a metric converts an intangible into management language and into targets that can demonstrate value within the organization.
Yeah, no, absolutely. One of the things that I really liked from what Barry was talking about was his sense-making thread in the episode, because that really resonated with me, particularly not just from a knowledge perspective, but also when you're thinking about risk of, how are we going to make sense of this? Because very often we have limited information, perhaps, and we have to make a decision. And it really resonated for me. And, he was using that sensor networking mapping approach. And he asks and he asks teams to plot the knowledge gaps on that framework each quarter. And he talks about like complex zones might trigger storytelling sessions. And complicated zones might trigger, a more formalized SOP upgrade, where there's a complicated sequence of events, but there's still a sequence of events that can be documented, and we can improve the way, maybe through visuals or visual management or whatever there to help that. But I really liked that type of knowledge response matches the type of problem. I really liked that. So the tools aren't just a kind of a pick and choose or pick and mix. It's really
theoretical.
Yeah, absolutely. And I really liked that. And he also noted that, where we have complex contexts, we should stay lightweight and story-driven and not over-tooled. Because in those complexities is the nuance that you're trying to convey. And that, AI can do a lot for us, but I don't think it'll be doing that kind of thing. And that's that storytelling element of getting people who understand that nuance to share their storytelling, and that will, evoke a response in the listeners, in the, whether they're more junior members or maybe another senior leader in another area or another SME in another area, but now they've been able to connect the dots as a result of that, that sense making. So I really, really liked that. And again, it kind of gets back to Anders' 6 traits of quality business leadership model, because he also warns of getting bolting too many linear controls onto complex systems. And even back to Kevin's push for proportional formality. Where the level of formality should be appropriate to the problem that you're addressing. I think a lot of that now really, really resonates, even though they're coming at it from completely different aspects of the business. We can see there's a real core way of the way in which we need to work and the way in which we have that mindset of working. So I think it and it also reinforces what Matt was saying, that, leaders must talk to the head and the heart, and stories reach the heart much more than and much more effectively than dashboards ever do. And certainly my experience of dashboards is, of course, we need to monitor and we need to measure and we need to report on these things. But mostly people look at the dashboard to see where their piece of the pie is and make sure they're in the green. And then they'll, and if somebody else in the red, well, that's fine, it's not me. And they're not really looking at it holistically in that sense. So I think, Matt really showed how mindsets can hardwire those behaviors, and Barry provided those kind of daily rituals, being psychologically safe, debriefs and story swaps, that can keep that mindset alive. And together, they turn that saying of culture eats QRM for breakfast into a practical menu of how we can actually digest this stuff on a daily basis. And it doesn't have to become something you only do periodically, or when there's training or when there's been an event and you have to all come together. These kind of things should be happening every day. And maybe there is a new metric out there, a time to knowledge metric, from incident to insight within 30 minutes or something. But it would be great. I love that latency concept.
Yeah, wouldn't that be lovely? Wouldn't that be lovely? And there was another little metric you mentioned as well, which I loved the subtlety of this one. He counts how often junior voices challenge the plan.
Yeah.
I mean, that idea of psychological safety as a knowledge KPI, it's in a way it's the simplest proxy for knowledge flow I ever heard. And you mentioned Amy Edmonson earlier, and that's one of our books, as we say. And I'd love to hear our listeners' views on that. Whether that would emerge as a useful metric. That would be very interesting. Or another lens of putting it on the same thing is, is silence an early warning signal of risk long before any formal metric starts alarming or moving? I know but thinking back to January, Kevin warned that poor hazard ID, and you spoke about that, can stem from high subjectivity and low science, so. But Barry's metric might be a useful indicator of hidden hazards. If a risk emerges and no one has spoke up about the hazardous situation that gave rise to it, despite the fact that they noticed it, is that a key culture indicator that we have to respond to? So lots of interesting thoughts there around culture, quality culture, risk culture, psychological safety. They all link in. I think we'll have a great discussion about that when we've read the book, so to speak. That segues us nicely into our episode on supplier oversight with Rosanna Bules, because she challenged us not just to track KPIs, but also to track KBIs, those behaviours that predict maturity.
Yeah, I absolutely loved that episode with Rosanna, who's herself a certified quality auditor, started out her career in Genentech in QC, and later ended up leading quality systems at Gilead's Oceanside site. My standout take home here was Rosanna's superbly simple explanation of how she separates intrinsic risk. And in that, she was talking about the impact of a risk and the criticality of that risk from the compliance risk, which are the actual performance data in her framework. We've all seen cases where performance issues go unnoticed because the initial risk category that was done at the time of onboarding that supplier just isn't revisited regularly enough, and the compliance data isn't integrated effectively enough into the oversight planning. And you might have a key account lead who's arm wrestling with a third party supplier, or indeed your third party supplier being completely frustrated with the lack of responsiveness on your own side, which I've also seen. And just the timing of the annual update is just not responsive enough in terms of the product that they may be supplying for you, or the critical raw material, or whatever that may be. So I loved Rosanna's approach. And her idea of evaluating suppliers based on the maturity of the relationship, resonates really strongly. And her suggestions on designing those metrics that reflect responsiveness, transparency, and commitment to continuous improvement are much more meaningful indicators for me of a relationship's health, way beyond, how many, kilos of product or liters of drug substance that they've produced for you, or, tableting events that they've done and shipped, way beyond those typical operational KPIs, or indeed, how many deviations have they had and how many kappas, etc. So for anyone managing third parties, and I've actually sent the link to several colleagues of mine who may not be regular Risk Revolution listeners who work in this space.
Gasp.
Yeah, I know, gasp, exactly. But I've actually said, for anyone working in that third party space and third party oversight space, which we know is fraught, and it is, the pandemic proved to us was not. We're not
complex.
Absolutely optimal there. If there's one thread again sewing every episode together, including Rosanne's episode, it's again this mindset shift, and she really talked about that, building partnerships rather than having it transactionally, founded on the QTA, the Quality Technical Agreement, or the supplier agreement that you have. And Kevin, he pushed us from compliance to science, and Anders had that cost language to make sure that we went from cost to value. And of course, Matt from the firefighting heroics to the fire prevention habits. And I think, what did Barry say? He was talking about something about before the ink dries or something, was it?
Barry said debrief before the ink dries. In other words, turn this idea of creating floods of documents and this, passive documentation culture into active story sharing culture, that metric, move it from a document to a story, to a lived learned experience quickly. I think we should have the same attitude to risk culture. It's more than a suite of documents. It is a knowledge sharing mindset, and perhaps silence is the loudest risk here. So Rosanna showed us how a living supplier matrix stops risk from fossilizing. So and in our GMP, in our KM Cafe last month, we reflected on trusting machines just enough. Full stop. Another kind of mindset leap, So look, if the first half of 2025 and our podcast series has taught us anything, it's risk, culture, knowledge. It's a three-legged stool. Kick one out, I think you're on the floor. What do you think?
Yeah, no, absolutely. And whether you're crunching hazards or crunching numbers and metrics or crunching code for your AI digitalization strategy, I think the 2025 mantra is absolutely clear. Change the mindset and the metrics will follow. As Kevin said, tools are tools, but the mindsets will move mountains. So I guess we kicked off the year asking if risk culture and knowledge could share the same space or even the same sentence. And I'd say 6 months later, we've shown just how integral each is to the other. So I'm really looking forward to our book club now. I've been reading away frantically and making loads of notes I'm in the old-fashioned actual paper book and making notes in the margins again. My pick for the book club for next month are two of Amy Edmondson's books, The Right Kind of Wrong, which I love, and The Fearless Organisation. And I know that Laurie's pick is that Turn the Ship Around, recommended by Barry Byrne, by David Marquet. And Val, your pick was?
Quality Risk. I was very sensible. Quality Risk Management, a practical guide by Jim Vesper and Amanda McFarland, two veterans in the field.
Yeah, and former podcast guests here as well.
Indeed.
So I guess indeed. I guess that's it for us at Risk Revolution. Keep the curiosity high, and the risks visible, and the knowledge flowing, and the storytelling going. Get reading and send us in your thoughts via our LinkedIn page on our book choices and any insights you gain from those. And we're looking forward to talking to you again next month on the book club. So it's a bye from Nuala.
And a bye from Val.